Hi, Miss Ball back again, chapter 4. So, as we did on the other 2 days, please get a writing utensil and a notebook, spiral, piece of paper, and we'll get started. Just going to click my screen over while you're making sure you have everything you need. And we'll get started on chapter 4. It's called Units. So, before we start, would you please write down in your spiral or on your paper the word protect? Protect. Underline TECT. This is the root of the word and it means cover. And now I want you to write protector. Protector, comma, protection, PROTEC, and then what says shun at the end of a word? TION, and then detect, DETECT. And we want to talk about how these words are related. So maybe with someone at home, you could go over those words with them. If you have a dictionary, you can look them up. If you don't, it's okay. We can talk about these when we get back to class. But I bet knowing you, you've heard all of these words. Now I'm going to skip ahead. We're going to talk about story elements as we go through the book. And again, at the beginning, we talked about the third person, the narrator telling the story and how the events unfold. We noticed the pronouns he and she. Okay. And let's see. Yeah, let's start. So please open to page 25. Standing in the cafeteria line, Greg opened his red plastic pencil case. He counted once and then counted again, just to be sure. Then he grinned. There were 13 left. Sweet. That means I sold 17 units. That's what Greg called the comic books he's been selling, units. And selling 17 units before lunch was a new sales record. Greg's comic books weren't the kind of sale at stores. Regular comic books were sort of tall, also a little floppy. Not Greg's. Greg's comic books were about the size of a credit card, and they could stand up on one end all by themselves. They were only 16 pages long, and he could fit about 50 of them into his pencil case. These comic books were short and sturdy, and that's why they were called chunky comics. Let's pause here. If you could name a comic book that you made, write down the name that you would call it. Okay, you can pause if you need to. Greg loved that name. He had chosen it himself. He got to pick the name because he was the author of all the chunky comic stories. He had drawn all the pictures, too. What do we call the person who draws the pictures in a book story? Starts with an I. Illustrator, exactly. And he was also the designer, the printer, and the binder. The binder puts it together so it's sturdy. Plus, he was the marketing manager, the advertising director, and the entire sales force. Chunky Comics was a one-of-a-kind operation, and that one kid was Greg Kenton. Greg snapped the pencil case shut and grabbed a tray. He took a grilled cheese sandwich, a cup of carrot sticks, and then he looked over the fruit cocktail bowls until he found one with 3 chunks of cherry. He got a chocolate milk from the cooler, and as he walked toward his seat, Greg did some mental math. Monday, the first day Chunky Comics had gone on sale, he had sold 12 units. Tuesday, 15 units. Wednesday, 18 units. And today, Thursday, he had already sold 17 units before lunch. So if you'd like to write those numbers down and add them, you can before I read the next part. So that was 62 units since Monday morning. And each unit book sold for 25 cents. Okay, so if you want to do the math before we get to that point, go ahead and do it. Hit pause. So the up to the minute sales total for September 12 was $15.50. Greg knew while sales were increasing. Word of mouth. Kids had been telling other kids about his comic book. The cover illustration was powerful, the inside pictures were strong, and the story was loaded with action. The title was Creon, Return of the Hunter, and it was Volume 1, Number 1, the very first of the Chunky Comics. So that made it a collector's item. So if you look to the right of that page, you can see the illustration. Some of you would love that illustration, and some of you might think it's a little creepy. I myself think it's a little creepy, but I know a lot of you would like that. So if you would like to hit pause and draw a cover of a comic book that you would create, you can do that now, or you can wait until we're done with this chapter. Maybe make a note on your note paper there that you want to remember to do that. Greg sat down at his regular lunch table next to Ted Kendall. Ted nodded and said, "Hi," but Greg didn't hear him. Greg picked up his sandwich and took a big bite. He chewed the warm bread and soft cheese, but he didn't taste a thing. Greg was still thinking about sales. $15.50 in 3.5 days. Not so hot. Greg had set a sales goal for the first week, $25, which meant that he had to sell 100 units. It looked like he was going to fall short. The idea of making and selling comics books had hit Greg like a crack, K-R-A-K. Do you remember what we call that? Sound words, onomatopoeia. Over the head from Superman himself. It made perfect sense. And there's the word sense again. Remember we wrote that earlier? Candy and gum were against school rules, and tiny toys were boring, and also against the rules. But how could he go wrong with selling little books? School was all about books and reading. True, reading a comic book wasn't exactly the same as reading a regular book, but still, there was a rack of comics right in the kids section at the public library downtown, and some new graphic novels, too. Comic books had been a part of Greg's life, forever, mostly because of his dad's collection. Batman, Superman, The Flash, Spider-Man, Marvel Classics, Uncle Scrooge, and all the Disney comics. I wonder how many comics you could name. I could only probably name about 10, maybe 15. You could hit pause if you'd like and try to see how many you can come up with. His dad's collection filled 3 shelves in the family room, and it was worth over $10,000. That's a lot of money. Once Greg had shown he knew how to take care of the comic books, he had been allowed to read and look at them all he wanted. Greg had even bought a few collectible comics of his own, mostly newer ones that weren't very expensive. It was his love of comic books that had first gotten Greg's interest in drawing. Comics had led Greg to books like How to Draw Comic Book Villains, You Can Draw Superheroes, Make Your Own Comic Book Art, and Draw the Monsters We Love to Hate. Back in 3rd grade, Greg had used his own money to buy India ink, dip pens, brushes, and paper at the art supply store, and drawing new comic book characters was one of his favorite things to do when he wasn't earning money. The whole summer before 6th grade, Greg had worked toward the launch of Chunky Comics. From the start, he felt pretty sure he could come up with the short story idea, and he knew he would be able to do the drawings. But first, he'd have to deal with a lot of hows. How does a whole comic book get put together? How big should each one be? How was he going to print them? How much would it cost him to make each one? And finally, how much money should he charge for his finished comic books, assuming he could actually make some? One by one, Greg had found the answers. An encyclopedia article about printing books had helped a lot. It showed how pages of a book start as one large sheet of paper and gets folded in half several times. Each time the sheet is folded, the number of pages is doubled. So Greg took a piece of regular-sized paper and folded it in half 3 times, the way it showed in the encyclopedia. That one piece of paper turned into a chunky little 16-page book, Chunky Comics. It was so simple, but not really. Greg figured out that making little comic books was a 10-step process. Write a story that can be told on 12 to 14 mini comic pages, sketch, draw, ink, and then letter all 16 mini pages, which included the front and back covers. So I like how they have the illustrations. You can't really read it. It's kind of got squiggles, but it's just showing you. It kind of helps you understand. And a lot of my kids in the past have used this example and made their own comic books, little chunky ones. So I'd encourage you to do that as your home. Number 3, paste 8 of the mini page drawings onto their correct positions on a piece of paper to make Master Copy 1, a sheet that can be copied again and again. Number 4, paste up the other 8 mini pages to make Master Copy 2. Using a copier, print the images from Master Copy 1 onto one side of a press sheet and a piece of regular-sized paper. Number 6, print Master Copy 2 onto the flip side of the press sheet, making 8-page images on the front and 8 on the back. You guys can't do that, but you can make one at home. Turning the page, carefully fold the press sheet with the 16 copied mini pages on it. Put in 2 staples along the crease at the very center of the book between pages 8 and 9. Trim the 3 unstapled edges, and that makes one finished mini comic book. And then repeat. You can see the illustration there. And authors use illustrations to help you understand, and I think this really does help clarify. And each of the 10 steps had to be done perfectly, or no one would ever want to spend money on his little comics. After all the hows had been settled, then came the writing. But Greg hadn't written just one story, he had developed a master publishing plan. Volume 1 was going to be about Creon, an incredibly intelligent Stone Age hero who helped his tribe deal with ancient dangers, like prehistoric beasts and Cro-Magnon mortars. Greg figured there all could be 7 or 8 issues about Creon. Chunky Comics Volume 2 would feature the future, where a superhero named Eon tried to protect a small colony of humans living in a world of melting ice caps and mutant life forms that were part human, part toxic sludge, and part recycled trucks and airplanes. Yeah, this totally sounds like some of you in these classes, rotations. Again, there were part recycled trucks and Again, there would be 7 or 8 issues featuring Eon. Then Chunky Comics Volume 3 would feature Leon, a fairly normal modern-age techno dude who suddenly finds himself energized when his digital automatic watch overheats and burns its circuits into the nerves on his wrist. Leon learns that the watch can be set for the future or the past. The 6 or 7 time travel adventures of Volume 3 would follow Leon to the past, where he would team up with Creon, and then to the future, where he would offer his services to the amazing Eon. And eventually, all 3 characters would have some final, top of page 34, episodes together. Creon, Leon, and Eon. Past, present, future. Creative. Not my cup of tea, but creative. Once the master plan was set, writing the first Creon story, Return of the Hunter, had been pretty easy for Greg. But the drawing was more difficult than he thought it would be. It had taken a long time to get each small page looking the way he wanted. It wasn't like doodling or sketching. These pictures had to be good enough to sell. When both covers and the 14th inside page had been drawn and inked and pasted in place to make the 2 master copies, Greg tackled his first printing. The copier he used was his dad's, and it was actually part of the printer that was hooked up to the computer in the family room. It was an inkjet printer, plus a scanner, plus a copier. One of those all-in-one machines, made copies of either black or white or color. Greg had stuffed about 40 ruined sheets of paper into the recycling bin before he had figured out how to get all 16-page images copied correctly onto the front and the back of one sheet of paper. But finally he had folded his first perfectly printed sheet, stapled it twice, and trimmed the top, front, and bottom edges. And then, one hot night in the middle of July, Greg stood there in his family room and thumbed through the very first copy of the very first issue of the very first volume of Chunky Comics. It had been a proud moment. That sounds pretty cool. He didn't give up, did he? Greg had done some record keeping along the way. He added up all the time and learned some bad news. It had taken him more than 60 hours to make the very first comic book. But there was good news too, because it took him only 2 more hours to print, fold, staple, and trim the next 100 copies of Volume 1, Number 1. And he'd worked on his drawing skills over the summer. Greg had gotten better, and faster too. Plus he'd had fun. He had dug out all his old drawing books, looking for shortcuts and new tips from pros. Drawing was something he could do at night, so he still got to enjoy his days outdoors, and also do the regular summertime jobs that kept money coming in. Drawing and inking the pictures for the next 2 comic books had only taken him about 20 hours, 9 to 11 hours each, and by the time school began in September, Greg had the master copy pages for the next 2 Creon issues all put together and ready to print. Plus he had 300 copies of Return of the Hunter, printed, folded, stapled, trimmed, and ready to sell. Making the comics had been fun, but Greg felt sure that selling them was going to be even better. If he kept the price at just $0.25 per issue, the profits were still going to be fantastic. He had figured it all out. Ink for the copier was pretty expensive, but Greg had a kit for refilling the cartridges. Altogether, ink for 1 comic plus 1 piece of paper plus 2 staples cost him less than 2 cents. So, not counting his own time, selling 1 chunky comic book was like turning 2 pennies into a quarter. The money was going to come rolling in. That seems pretty good to me. Digging around in the fruit cocktail on his lunch tray, Greg stabbed one of the cherry pieces with a fork. As he chewed the sweet fruit, Greg reviewed his sales figures again, and then he shrugged. $15.50. Still not terrible. I mean, this is a brand new business. All things considered, Greg decided that Chunky Comics was off to a pretty good start. And before lunch was over, Greg had hired Ted to become the first sales agent for Chunky Comics, offering him a nickel for every 2 copies he sold. So Greg was still hoping to reach that goal of selling 100 units the first week. But business can be a lot like life, full of unexpected events. Boy, don't we know. And 33 minutes later, standing in the hallway next to the music room, Greg and his new company got a shock. There were 2 minutes left before sixth grade chorus, and Greg was making the most of his time. He had just sold 2 copies of Return of the Hunter to Roy Jenkins when Ted came up and pressed something into his hand. Greg glanced down and saw a mini comic. Then he noticed the expression on Ted's face. "What?" he asked. "Something wrong with this one?" Ted nodded and said, "Take a look." Greg turned the little book over. Ted was right. Something was very wrong with this one, because what Greg held in his hand was not one of his chunky comics. Look at the illustration. Does that look like something that Greg would do? The Lost Unicorn? Turn your page, 38. We'll finish this chapter. A tiny banner on the front cover announced that this was an eensy beensy book. The title was The Lost Unicorn, and the cutesy cover picture had been brightened up with colored pencil. It doesn't sound like Greg. A deep scowl formed on Greg's face as he realized what he was holding. It was obvious. Some other kid was trying to cash in on his idea. And who was this person responsible for this? The sneak attack, this giant ripoff. Greg didn't even have to look. He knew. Only one person would have dared to copy his idea like this. But Greg turned to the first page of the little book and looked away. And there was proof, in tiny, perfect cursive, just below the title, written and illustrated by Maura Shaw. Okay, so just like we did on the other couple days, I want you to draw a line in your spiral or on your paper and just do a summary of what this chapter was about and where we left off, so that when you continue, you'll remember what was happening in the story. Again, 3 to 5 sentences, indent, and I will see you for your next lesson. Bye. Love ya.